Please find your seats. We're just about to start. One minute, then we are starting. Please find your seats. 30 seconds. Yeah, let's see. Okay, good morning. I guess some of us felt slightly depressed about what's happening in Europe yesterday, but there's hope, because today, 70 years ago, Elvis recorded his first song ever. It's all right. And I guess we could also take sort of comfort or generate some hope from another song, a little less conversation, a little more action. Maybe that could also be something that could sort of be of inspiration to us all. And here I'm not referring to the session that we had on the terrace yesterday, but I did bring my whistle. But I think we also have to look into what happened yesterday, because there was definitely action. And now I can see that Tim is coming into the room. Tim, could you just go over there to no. Because I wanted to quote what Tim wrote this morning, I presume, about the British election, because I think that sums up the action that happened last night. I quote, "British election 2024 analysis. Worst Conservative result ever in parliamentary seats. Best Liberal result since 1923. But Labour national vote very little up. Key was collapse of SNP in Scotland and Reform UK splitting right-wing vote. Think AfD and Le Pen," quote unquote. And we also had action in Germany, because at 5:39, we had Olaf Scholz, Robert Habeck, and Christian Lindner agreeing upon a new budget within the Schuldenbremse. So maybe it's all right, at least until Sunday. We have, as also Tim pointed out last night, we have a majority government in the UK. We still apparently have a government in Germany. And well, let's see what happens after Sunday. Let's also just give a hand of applause to the organizers with the evening at Prado yesterday night. So Javier, Nacho, and the entire ECFR team, which made that possible, I think we'll all remember that event. And it almost felt like a sort of a family reunion, right? But that's also what ECFR HCMs are about, meeting each other in the family. And obviously, we're always extending the family, and we're apparently also sort of following the rules about energy efficiency, I can sense here with the lights going out. Anyway, enough of me. Over to you, Jana, with the first panel.
Disco light show, I think. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jana Polirin. I'm the director of our office in Berlin, and I warmly welcome to this morning's panel. I want to run it more like a series of espresso shots and not so much like a latte macchiato experience, so that you are all wide awake afterwards. Our topic is, Woe's Order, Is It Anyway? Unpacking a Middle Power-Led World. And at ECFR, we've started to work a lot on the emerging international order and the deep change that we think is underway. We just started in April a 3-year project called Reorder, where we want to look at different visions of order, as well as the interplay between economic might and geopolitical influence. So stay tuned. And Mark has just actually started a mini podcast special series within The World in 30 Minutes, which he calls The World After the West. So this gives you an idea of the topic that is at hand this morning. And I'm delighted that I don't need to talk about it, but that I have four great panelists, and I will introduce them briefly. We have Professor Wang Jixing, who is the founding president of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies with the University of Peking. We have Hina Rabbani-Khan, who is the former Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in Pakistan. We have Sergio Rodriguez, who is head of policy planning at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. And we unfortunately don't have Abayo Olunkoshi, who is our visiting fellow from Africa. So this is not Abayo, but don't despair. This is Theo Murphy, our director of the Africa program at ECFR, who will, I think, be as good as he can. So, I'm old enough to know Facebook and to know the status, what is the status of your relationship. And I want to start by asking you briefly about the status of the international order we are in. If you would need to describe it, how do you perceive the changes that are underway? What is going on with our so-called liberal international order, and where are we headed? More towards systemic competition, towards multipolarity. So if you could basically, in a nutshell, give your status of the international order.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I think from the Chinese perspective, the international order is still an order that is dominated by the Western world, and we are not very satisfied with that. But does China has a version of its own international order? Not yet. We have proposals like building up a world community of shared future, which doesn't mean very specifically what we are talking about. So the existing international order dominated by the Western countries are based on their values, and China has its own values. That China says we have a long history of civilization, and we have been weakened by the Western world. About 100 years ago, now we have recovered and we are rising up. So one question we ask ourselves is whether the existing international order can be changed according to China's needs and according to the needs of the Western, of the developing world. So one central question we ask ourselves, and I ask myself, is how is the world divided? Is there two worlds or three worlds? In the past, we talked about a third world. Now we are talking about the global south. But the first question I ask myself is China part of the global south? And our leader and our diplomats insist that China is part of the global south. So if you are talking about middle powers, we are not a middle power, but we are a large power, but we are part of the global south. But is this recognized by other countries? Not necessarily. I don't think, for instance, India is part of global south. We have no question about that. Pakistan is global south. But if India holds a conference for the global south, on behalf of the global south, do they invite China? Probably not. So when we say we are part of the global south, and we always say we are representing the interests of the developing world. So the traditional idea is the world is divided between developed world and developing world, and that was in Mao Zedong years and also the Deng Xiaoping years. Now, many analysts in the West are talking about three worlds. That is, one world, represented by Western countries, follow the liberal international order. And the other world is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the so-called dictatorships or whatever you call it. And then you have the global South. And the West, on the one hand, and China and other, Russia, they are competing with each other in the global South. That is what some people in the West are talking about. Some people in China, I hesitate to say, but some people in China think the same way. Although we say we are part of the global South, actually we are talking about we in China and Russia and North Korea. We don't say that openly, but in practice, we are closer to Russia, closer to Iran, and to some extent closer to North Korea. And now North Korea and Russia are getting together, supporting each other in the Ukraine war. China says we are neutral, but you know that there are different opinions in the world as to what China's role is playing in this war. So I should stop here and I ask a question.
Yeah, but I have a question for you to follow up, because you did not really mention the United States here. And as you said, many people here in the West seem to think that the competition between China and the US and the antagony between the two countries is going to be one of the driving forces for this new order. How do you think that is in reality seen from your perspective?
In China, we say the Western world led by the United States. Mm-hmm. So in my opening remarks, I deliberately didn't mention that. People say we are on one hand representing the interest of global South and developing countries, and on the other side is the United States. And the Western world is led by the United States. Mm-hmm. I don't really like that idea, especially when I'm speaking in Europe. Are you led by the United States? Not necessarily. You don't say that. Your allies, and the United States is the most important country in NATO. So the NATO is not necessarily led by the United States, but the United States plays a very important role, a crucial role in NATO. So in that sense, the United States is part of the West and leading the West. But in economic terms, it is not necessarily the case. And in issues like global, climate change and global governance, the United States cannot dominate.
Thank you. Hina, over to you. From your perspective, what is the status of the international order?
Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is maybe do a statement, a bit of an assessment, and then the way forward or what I think is about to happen. I don't like to look at the world as us and them. And I do not like to use the nomenclatures which are usually used to define and divide us, because I grew up in a world where I was told that we were all equal, that we all could progress and develop if we all did play by the rule book. Mm-hmm. And then I saw the rule book change, because the world around us changed. Okay, and I think that's really the moment where we are today, is because we want the rule book to change because the world has changed. Okay, and that's for a country which was told that it's fine, let your industry die because it's inefficient, let your car industry not be, subsidized, etc. It's kind of rich to see, the rule book change. Okay, so the statement I wanted to start off with was that a lot of people in the West, and I always find myself in a unique place, because when I'm in the Eastern corridors, I'm seen to be too Western. And when I'm in the Western corridors, I'm seen to be only representing the Eastern. I think I try and represent values and whatever I see to be right or wrong, rather than a certain sort of hemisphere. Okay, so the deal is, the statement I wanted to sort of say was that typically people believe that the liberal international order is being threatened by autocratic countries, whether it's Russia or China, or whatever you view as autocratic, right? I don't think it has to do with how much democracy they have, etc., or how many years a leader has been in power, because we know a lot of democratic countries have very good relations with countries where leaders have been in power for 30, 40 years, and not so much democracy exists. But that's okay, but some others are not okay. So the threat to the liberal democratic international order is actually emanating from the bastions of the democratic order itself, okay? Because eventually an order is good or bad because of what it does for the people. An order is not good or bad just because we like the name democracy. We like what democracy does, not just democracy for the, So it's really important looking at it, all of this happening from the outside and not being really a player, right? So you can't say, oh, Pakistan is the preserver of order or the changer of order. So we're just looking, and as someone who entered politics at the tender age of 25 and has already had 22 years of experience, I still feel very young and understand that I'm quite old, and that I've seen the world change so much from my 2 terms in office, which was only 10 years apart, and I felt everything had changed. So as a world which was moving together to solve problems, we were a world which didn't care about the problems, but just wanted our hegemonic sort of. So when we say order, do we mean leadership? I'm all for everybody fighting for leadership. Leadership has to deliver, on the goods, on the global goods, right? Who's taking the leadership on climate change? Who's taking the leadership on, AI, artificial intelligence, how to manage it? What about laws? I mean, lethal autonomous weapons. We have been on the receiving end of drone strikes, which are, authorized in places where no one has an impact of what happens on the ground, right? So the liberal international order has actually been threatened by the actions of the democratic world rather than the other way around. And for that, the best examples are 2 wars. Afghanistan. We refuse to look at what has happened in Afghanistan. So I think even when you look at the Ukraine war right now, I think the Western world has a tendency to get very quickly into wars and make really big statements, but not really understand what is the end game and how long are you willing to hold on. And then when Afghanistan happens, when you pull out, literally pull the plugs and just leave with people hanging on the planes, and it's fine because you move on to the next. Well, the people where this happens, the geographies where this happens, do not have the luxury to move on. So therefore, please, let's internalize the fact that the threat is not external, it's actually very, very internal. And the type of leadership that we're throwing, we saw in the debate in the US, it's not very inspiring. It really isn't very inspiring.
I think that is the understatement of the day, but...
Right? So quickly moving forward to where we are. Look, currently, first of all, whether you like it or not, the Western world has been able to, and for that you have a deepest respect. For all of us have our deepest respect. We have been able to truly universalize certain values. The rest of the world expects you to let those values be universal. And not to be dismayed when some children of certain color, caste, creed, geography are killed with impunity, and completely be undismayed when the children of another geography, another religion are being killed with impunity. And the answer that, oh, they're a democracy, they can go ahead and murder with impunity, is a terrible one. You are actually not doing any favors. I just want to mention this one thing because I think it's important. Yesterday I was shocked when someone got up from the audience and said that, because the Palestinian Authority has been, 19 years, etc. So how can Europeans ascribe to that value that doesn't represent European? And I asked myself the question, does killing of hundreds and thousands of children with impunity, where the UN and your international order is all screaming that this is absolutely unprecedented, is that what represents European values? So I think really this is a moment where perhaps looking at it from the outside, Europe has to stand up. Because Europe truly does, in many ways, represent that universality of values. And if in Europe doesn't stand up, it becomes a little bit difficult, right? So if you, just to specifically say, if you're asking where do I see the order, I will end by saying that, this statement at least, that the world has changed disproportionately. Massive tectonic shifts have happened in the world. Whether you look at it from a social perspective, social media, everything else, whether you look at from technology perspective, AI, etc., whether you look at from the economic perspective. You know, when I entered politics, the US and Europe were the largest economies of the world. They were the largest bigger givers of technology in the world, right? I would recommend everyone who hasn't, perhaps read the article, which was a cover story by The Economist on the scientific revolution in China, right? And how they are ahead in many. So we have to accept that the world has changed. If we want to hold on to an order that doesn't deliver to the world, which is no more the same, then we will see a lot of war. And I also want to say that I'm just shocked at how much war and military spending is becoming so fashionable and so, a sign of your, so all of these were things which we were told were bad things. So they cannot now become good
I
things.
think I stop you here to leave a few other topics for the debate later, and I move, but I think we should just state for the moment that you basically said that when it comes to the liberal order, the Western democracies that lead this order have basically done bigger damage to the order than the autocracies, that what in the Western world is perceived as autocracies. I think that was a very strong statement. Sergio, how does the world order look like from Brazil? When I was there last year, I heard a lot about multipolarity and rejection of any notion of a new Cold War or of systemic competition as basically the main driver. So is that still the case? Yes.
Well, thank you, Jana. This is certainly a very interesting topic and very important one. I think there's no question that there's a major redistribution of power underway in the international system, whereby the system is becoming less centered on the Western Bloc countries, so to speak, and is being increasingly shaped by a combination of great power competition on the one hand, and on the other hand, a greater role played by middle powers, most of which are non-Western countries from the global South. Now, these structural changes, coupled with the situation of rising geopolitical tensions, the fraying of international regimes, proliferation of mutually reinforcing crises, creates further instability and uncertainty in the system. And the system hasn't been able to address these challenges, hasn't been able to cope with these crises. We've seen it with regard to Gaza, we've seen it with regard to Ukraine, etc. And so the need for reform becomes more urgent than ever. And so, in our view, these changes are not probably going to come out of internal processes in each one of those institutions involved. The UN, the WTO, the multilateral financial institutions. And so we believe that the G20 is a space or a forum where we have a greater chance of making progress on the reform of global governance. And indeed, this topic is one of the 3 top priorities of the Brazilian presidency of the G20. The other 2 are the fight against inequality, poverty, and hunger, and the promotion of sustainable development and energy transitions. Now, with regard to global governance reform, what we've been trying to do in the G20 is to use the forum of foreign ministers and to provide a space for discussion of this topic, but in an inclusive manner. And so one initiative, a main initiative we've launched in that area is that we are convening a meeting of foreign ministers of the G20, but open to all members of the UN, and it's going to take place during the General Assembly High-Level Week next September. Do we expect to have a revolutionary change from that process? Of course not, but I think the idea is to use this forum, which is very important, to make some progress in mobilizing support and trying to get some new ideas out of it. Now, I wanted to say a few words about BRICS, because for Brazil, this is a very important platform also for reform of the international system. As you know, BRICS is a platform for economic cooperation, for political coordination. We have built financial institutions. We have the new development bank, the contingency reserve agreement. But above all, we see BRICS as a constructive force for reform towards a more democratic, multipolar, inclusive international system. And I would like to stress the word reform, because sometimes in interacting with Western colleagues, we seem to, I mean, I get the sense that there is this view that BRICS is trying to create an alternative order or to upend the current order, and that's not the case. The case is really for reform, because you see, this has to be a collective undertaking. And you know, just like the current order was not created by Western fit, you know, it was the result of long negotiations and long battles across regional, political, and cultural divides between North and South. So just like this was the case with the current order, even though it's Western dominated still, like the professor said, we are not going to achieve reform of the system without, you know, the Western countries working together with the global South.
Sergio, can I push you a bit on this? Where do you think the BRICS could offer a constructive solution to any of the big problems that the world is facing, like, I don't know, climate change or debt? Anything constructive that BRICS Plus could offer that we cannot achieve through any other form of multilateral cooperation? What is the added value?
Well, the first added and basic added value is that I think you get very different countries to agree on a common platform for reform. This is the first thing. And then when you get into specifics, that's where we have to work. Well, with regard to the WTO, the dispute settlement system, is there anything we can do? You know, China is a member of BRICS. You know, India is a member of BRICS. And so there is a potential that we need to explore. We don't have ready-made solutions. But what I want to stress is that there is the willingness and the openness to engage, you see? And sometimes I don't feel that this is the reading that the West is making of it.
I'll later give it back to you to comment on how you see the kind of popping up of mini-lateralisms that are not inclusive, but like the G7 or BRICS Plus exclusive. But first, I want to hand it over to Theo for an African, I mean, I know Africa is a continent, there is not the Africa perspective, so, but having said all that.
Yeah, as Jana mentioned, of course, we really wanted to have our colleague Adebayo here. He didn't quite manage to navigate the maze of the Schengen visa in time, but he and I had been running a process of reflection on global order where there's an African component and a European component. So I think I can do my best to channel his views on this. And I'll add a little bit of a comparison between where Africa falls maybe closer to China's developing vision of global order or closer to the West, because I think that's quite interesting. We break it down into four aspects. The first one we could call the architecture of global governance, or if we want to speak a bit more plainly, I think it's the distribution of power within the existing architecture. And here, as you all will know, I mean, there's a feeling that the West dominates very much the architecture, the organs of international governance. And I think Africa is calling for a more equitable share so that that be distributed along lines of population, maybe less so on wealth. And I think China is seen there as something of the leader of the opposition. If we were to look at the world community as incumbents, let's say the West, incumbent within the structures of power and global governance, and then the opposition who's saying things need to change or needs to be reformed. The second pillar or aspect pertains to kind of the rules that guide the way states relate to each other, right? And these are more or less the first 7 articles in the UN Charter. And here there should be a tie. It should be something that is seen as equally defended by the West and Europe, and also by China and others, right? I think this is something that China would say we subscribe to, in other parts of the world we subscribe to them. They're very minimalistic when you look at them carefully, and they're mostly rules about what you shouldn't do, no? So this is non-interference, non-aggression, respect for territorial integrity. So basically playing well with others and not going over the lines. This is something we subscribe to as well in Europe. But
I think China hinted at this, that
yes,
they subscribed it but had problems to
exactly. And
stick to our promises.
Exactly. We haven't been perfect in the implementation of it. And I think that's very much the perception of Africa. So that China seems to be more beholden to the spirit of those principles, at least up until now, than the West has. The third issue, which I think is really interesting, and I'd love Professor Wang Ji's take here, is on rights, the place of rights in foreign policy. And here you have sort of Africa straddling the fence. Africa does have a view that there are rights that transcend absolute state sovereignty. They have articles in the African Union Constitutive Act, which is a supranational charter, which talk about non-interference, but which also talk about non-indifference, very important. And non-indifference in cases where there's extreme war crimes, genocide, things like that. The reason why, and to contrast this with what I've understood from China's point of view, is that there's a more absolute focus on state sovereignty, one, and then second, that rights are the prerogative of each state to develop for themselves. So you may look at the stage of development that you are in your state and then say, these are the rights that suit where we are at this moment, which is not a universalist concept. That's then very particular. So Africa has something that's a bit more universalist, at least Pan-African. But I think we come down here as sort of a tie between Africa and the West, because although Africans see that there's something beyond the nationally defined, Africa wants to be the one that judges when these rights have been transgressed. That's one. Africa judges, not Europe. And then second, decides on what course of action to take, how to censure the state that is transgressing them. And the feeling in Africa is that there's not an African lead on these issues, but that Europe is allowing its take on rights to determine its relations and beyond the international system's relations with Africa. My last one, the fourth, is on the kind of the positive case. So if the UN Charter is the negative case, what you don't do, the positive case of global order is also important. And I think here, if I've understood correctly, China's position that economic development is something that the global order must deliver in order to have value addition is something that resonates fantastically in Africa. And Africa has taken the lesson from China that the way to rise in the international system, the way to be able to claim your rights, not just demand them, is to be economically strong. And this is the incredibly inspirational story, I think, I don't know about in the rest of the global south, but definitely in Africa, of China's rise. And I don't see what our European story is there. Is it globalization? Is it neoliberalism? Because it hasn't worked. It hasn't delivered economic development for Africa. At least that's the perspective from there. So I'll wrap it up there.
I now rely entirely on your wisdom. So whoever feels ready to defend globalization, multilateralism, the Western liberal order is very welcome to take the floor, all others as well. But maybe we can collect some questions. Nacho and Volodymyr are the first, maybe in the reverse. No, yeah.
Hi, hello. I'm Nacho Torreblanca, head of the ECFR office in Madrid, and this is a question to Sergio. To which extent do you think that Russia undermines the legitimacy and credibility of BRICS? And then in terms of the peace plan proposed together by China and Brazil on Ukraine, can you give us some details about the making of this and the goals of it, given the fact that if it's about defending international law, it should call for the withdrawal, of course, of Russia, immediate withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine and the return of the territories that are annexed. I mean, under which principles of international law can China and Brazil not demand an immediate withdrawal? Thank you.
Thank you. Volodymyr is next, and Timothy.
Thank you. It's rather a reflection. Volodymyr Yermolenko, I'm a philosopher from Ukraine. It's rather a reflection. I would like all of you to comment on this. I think that it's wrong to locate values geographically. So, and it's a mistake from the West, obviously, but now it's a mistake from the global South, or from the global South or non-Western world, because the question we should ask is, do values of human dignity, that human life matters, are valid or they are not? And the reproach from the global South to the West is that, look, West, you're hypocritical because you declare something and you don't follow it, which I, of course, fully agree, because we have lots of situations. But my question is, at least from me as a Ukrainian, I'm looking at Russia. Do we see a protest against the war in Russia, as we see protests against the war in Afghanistan, in the United States, against Vietnam? We see lots of protests right now, mobilization of the civil society in the West against Israel operation in Gaza. Do we see that? Shall we see protests in China if China starts a military operation? So on the one hand, we have hypocrisy, but at least we have a certain declaration of values which are universal for all of us. Because if it's not universal for all of us, and if Global South suggests a value system in which human life doesn't matter, I hope it does not suggest that, in which human life doesn't matter, human dignity doesn't matter, then I personally don't need this world. I personally think that we need to defend ourselves against this world, because slavery, indignity is a rule of human history. And at a certain moment, not necessarily in the West, but there were other values developed. Of course, they followed hypocritically. Yes, I'm shorting. Sorry for this reflection.
I think your main point came through and was an excellent point, and I'll give it back to the panel and force them to answer this. But
okay, thank you.
By now, so many people wanted to take the floor that I need to cut you short now. Really, it's more kind of a single shot espresso and nothing more. Tim.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. 2 quick questions. First of all, how useful do you think the term middle powers actually is? If it means middle-sized powers, well, as Professor Wang said, China is not a middle-sized power. It's, I would say, a superpower. India is clearly a major power. Russia is, in significant respects, a major power. If it means in the middle of something or between something, then in the middle of or between what? So how useful is the term middle powers? Secondly, following on from Volodymyr Yermolenko, what do you think the impact of the way the war in Ukraine ends, i.e., put very simply, Russian victory or Ukrainian victory, will be on the distribution of power and the relation between the powers in this complex new international system?
Thank you. So I have 3 more people that I know of that want to take the floor. So please also consider the single shot espresso approach the one to follow here because we have 15 minutes and I want to do a second round, but this is already a lot. You might want to comment on the BRICS, BRICS Plus, what can it achieve, why is it important, or multilateralism still, that was what especially Sergio brought up, but then the questions very much about Russia. So Russia undermines the credibility of the BRICS, yes or no? What about the peace plan? And then what I found particularly interesting is this double standard accusation that came through very much from all of your presentations. But I mean, aren't there also double standards on the other side? And should we see more protest also from the global south or plural south? Middle powers, is that a useful term? And how does the war end? I know that it's a lot, but we'll try to get there. And Professor Wang, I start with you.
I have a question about whether Brazil is a middle power.
But we leave this to Sergio to tell us.
And, you know, we talk about BRICS, and Brazil is the only country representing South America in BRICS. But we have expanded BRICS to include some other countries. I think that will continue to expand. You know, Argentina has some hesitation, but there are some other newcomers who are interested. For instance, Thailand, and then some other countries in the Middle East. So this is a very complicated case. Do we have any political agenda? I think BRICS has played a role in making economic cooperation among those countries, and they established a bank. And they share the same satisfaction about the global order, about the West as a whole, but they don't have a clear set of agenda or purpose in the long run. So we'll have to wait and see what is going to happen. And then about another organization is also rising, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Xi Jinping is now visiting Central Asia. And whether the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is representing Central Asia, or it includes Pakistan, India, Iran, and maybe in the future it will also include Mongolia. So it is not simply centered on Central Asia. It is broad. It is broadening. It is extending to the other parts of the world. So we have different organizations, different institutions rising up, and the role played by Europe should be welcomed. But in the sense that we have so many Europeans, but are you united as one voice to speak to the outside world, saying this is the European point of view, or this is simply a French point of view? That is also, we have a problem with that. And the United States is divided now. Polarization and who is going to win the election, we'll have to wait and see. So we have to prepare for in the long run, what we should do. And one thing that is touched upon is whether the economic growth is the top priority. To China, it is. But we talked about China's demographic changes. This is not simply economic. That is distribution of wealth. And that is a problem we also have to talk about.
So I think the audience has noticed that you carefully avoided to talk about Russia, which I cannot accept at this point. So there were questions about the relationship between China and Russia, the the Chinese view on what Russia does in Ukraine. It violates international law. I think this is common ground that we can agree on. So what is the Chinese perspective? And also coming back to what Tim has said and how this will end. So how do you see the possibility for China playing an ever more constructive role in solving this?
I think this is a difficult question, I confess, because personally I'm against aggression of any country to another country. But the Chinese official position is that we have not decided whether who is the aggressor, who is not the aggressor, and then we are interneutral. But interneutral doesn't mean that China doesn't have interest. When we talk about the Chinese-Russian relationship, there are two parts of the issue. The first part is obviously geopolitical concerns of both countries. And Russia is squeezed by the West, by NATO. And it has its intention to protect itself. And China's geopolitical position that we are sandwiched by NATO on the other side and the United States in Asia on the other side. That is, we don't like NATO, but we don't like US-led alliances in Asia, what they call the Indo-Pacific region. That is the reason why China and Russia is coming together. That is the geopolitical point of view. But another important dimension, which I think is more important, is that we share the common interest in resisting Western schemes to destabilize Russia and China. The West is supporting some dissidents in Russia, and they want to have some more political changes in Russia, and they say the same thing to China, that you have a Xinjiang problem, you have Tibet problem, you have human rights problem, and you don't like the current leadership in China. And that is the more important linkage between Russia and China. So we are faced with some common threat or some common problem from the West to destabilizing our domestic structure. That is why the Chinese and Russian leaders are talking to each other almost every day, saying we should resist their cause, we should resist their pressure.
Thank you. As I said, time is progressing quickly, and I have 3 more people, but especially maybe the question about the double standards and
sure.
shortcomings
so
on the side of the global
double
south.
shot espresso.
Yeah, super.
Okay, cool. Okay, so first of all, I think on the double standards, I think absolutely everyone seems to be having double standards, but I want to make this one distinction. The global south and the others, the non-Western others, do not go to war for human rights. They do not go to war, and they do not give sanctions to the extent of starvation in countries because of not following democracy, not going by human rights. So there is a very big distinction. The global south are quite open about it. They're like, your problem, your territory, I'm not going to go take you, and my foreign policy pillars are not on what human rights record you have. So I think there's a very, very important distinction when that happens. On Tim's question, I thought that was a very interesting question, and I've always struggled with that. And I think what we mean, at least to me, when we say middle powers, it's not really economic, what's your GDP is. It's really who are the swing states. And it comes in some ways from the us and the them. Are you on this side or on that side? And that also takes me to this whole question of the multilateralism or the mini-lateralism. I think this is dangerous, because where will the rules end? So what we're doing is we're fencing the world, and we're saying, okay, within this part of the world, these rules will apply, and this mini-lateralism. But the big multilateralism is what is actually what is called universal. And I just want to, at the end, just say that as far as the impact of war in Ukraine is concerned, look, I think it's really important to understand that what we're seeing play out has a lot to do with the 2 failed or badly gone wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq created a precedent of going without Security Council resolution into another country, and that has its, and then how they ended up created a really bad precedent. And just want to make this last say this last line, that if you look deeply into it, I think the West has had a tendency to go into wars and take on things without really realizing what is their sustaining power. And when it comes to the question of human rights and human dignity and how much can you take the example of Afghanistan and girls and women in Afghanistan, where every president preceding the last one, and himself included as vice president, said, we are here to protect women's rights. And imagine what those 40 million population, half of them women, feel when the time comes and everybody flocks, the flock goes away. Yeah.
Thank you. Sergio, does Russia undermine the credibility of BRICS? And is Brazil a middle power? And is this even a useful concept?
Oh my God. Look, does Russia undermine the credibility of the BRICS? I honestly don't think that this is the case, because you see, within BRICS, the opinions and the views and the positions diverge a lot. In specific case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's an example. I mean, you don't see a BRICS unified position in support of Russia or anything like that. And different BRICS members had different positions individually. And so right after the invasion, there was this General Assembly resolution and the Security Council resolution. We were in the Security Council at that moment. And in both cases, we voted against the invasion and condemning the invasion, because it is a violation of international law, one of the basic principles of international law. Territorial integrity. But you see, we firmly believe in this, but we also are staunch defenders of the peaceful settlement of disputes. And we don't think that the way to find a solution to this conflict is going to be military. It has to be reached by a political settlement at some point. Now, are the conditions there? Obviously not. And we have been trying to engage in any process that can lead to creating those conditions. And so Brazil was part of the Copenhagen process since day one. We participated in all the meetings with the national security advisors, but we were not, we didn't sign the Bergenstock Declaration, because all along the process we made proposals. We were trying to make the point that you need to include somehow Russia at some point in the process. We made proposals to that effect that were not taken into account. So at the end of the day, we felt that that process was not going to result in concrete advances. And so we decided to coordinate with China, because we believe that China is the only country that can exert a positive influence on Russia in terms of trying to contribute to bringing them to any kind of process that we might be able to create. So this is about creating the conditions for a political settlement. This is the crux of the China-Brazil Memorandum, Common Understanding, as we call it. Because you see, in a political settlement, sometimes you need to have negotiations about negotiations, to a greater or lesser extent. That's even fundamental, because the parties are not going to sit at the table if they don't know what are going to be the conditions, but then you cannot prejudge in trying to arrange these pre-negotiations that might create the conditions. So this is what we're trying to do. If it's going to result, but we're making an effort, because we have said we don't want to be part of the conflict. We want to be part of the solution to the conflict. And so, as they say in English, you have to put your money where your mouth is. So that's what we're trying to do.
Quickly on the middle power, I want to bring
middle
three more people
middle
in.
power, well, good question by the professor, of course. I don't know if you can have a scientific definition about that. Of course, there are the obvious cases. China is a superpower. I perfectly agree with that. India is a major power. They are both nuclear powers. We cannot forget. It's not only economic, might and political weight. they are nuclear powers, both of them. Brazil is not. Brazil has renounced nuclear weapons, having developed indigenously, autonomously, the capacity to build them. We don't regret this decision.
Okay.
But, this means that, what our place in the international community, what we aim to it to be.
Thank you. Theoretically, we were at the end, but I've negotiated with Vessela secretly, and I get 5 more minutes. And I want to bring the questions at least in. I think we cannot answer them, and I give Theo, of course, the opportunity to make a final remark. But I think sometimes it's also important to hear the questions, and they will lead us also through the rest of the day. So there was Karl, our co-chair. There was one here and one over there, and you already have the mic. So.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your very interesting discussion. I am Raimundo Robredo. I'm the ambassador of Spain to South Africa. You asked us before to defend the liberal world order. I'll try to do so in 10 seconds or less. The last 80 years have brought more prosperity and peace than any 80-year period previously in history. For the South in particular, inequality has risen within states, has dropped globally enormously. Never before was the standard of living of African or Asian or South American worker closer to that of a European one, and life expectancy and peace and so on and so forth. So we talk about reform of that order. And Europe, in my opinion, the West, should not be seen as blocking reform, because blocking change is a losing proposition, always. So we should engage. That is my personal view. The problem that I find in South Africa and in Africa and beyond is we don't know what to engage on because of the 2 questions that I want to pose to you. First one is, what set of rules improves on the ones we have today? Case in point, the Security Council reform, where, for instance, Africa demands 2 permanent seats with veto power, and others would do the same, so that would block the Security Council effectively. And the second question is, even if we can find those rules, would the South agree? Because it seems to me that the interests of China, Brazil, India, and others are not necessarily the same. You all, maybe we all agree on the need to change, but we don't know in which direction, and I don't think there's actually agreement even in the South. So
Thank you. I will never believe if anybody says 10 seconds questions, but I give someone over here had a final question, and then I give it to Theo, and maybe you can address also the question from an African perspective that was, or whether you share the observation made on Africa.
Thank you very much. Søren Pind, former Minister of Development from Denmark. I have a question for Theo. So you say that in Africa they find the Chinese example very inspiring, the economical example. And on the other hand, you say that they see globalization as something Western, and it's kind of, they see it very critically. But I would suggest that the Chinese awakening, as Napoleon famously alluded to, would never have happened so fast without globalization, without NAFTA, without the inner market in Europe, and without the Western order. So how do these 2 points, how do they logically go together?
So Theo, maybe you can wave those 2 comments and questions into your final remarks, and you have 1 minute, 30 seconds, and then we need to end it.
I'm not sure. Is the mic on? Yeah, okay. Just to take the last question first. So actually, I had not totally completed the thought. The question coming from Africa vis-a-vis globalization is, what are we in Africa to make of what you in Europe are doing about it? So quite right, globalization seemed to have served also China and Europe. But now Africa is looking at the way we're friend-shoring, decoupling, so on and so forth, and saying, but hold on a second. So are you and Europe retreating from your own concept? And what is that supposed to, what are we supposed to understand there in terms of your constancy, in terms of thought and concepts? So it's not that they were totally against it. I think my friend Raimundo, who knows the tough questions to put, in terms of what there is to concretely negotiate with Africa on global order, there's a tricky complication here, which is that Africans are very aware that there's going to be two phases in this global order evolution, and we're in the interregnum right now. The interregnum has a certain set of rules, and those set of rules for Africa are basically need to have relationships with everybody, don't cut ties with anyone. So that means you will put forward what you would like to have more of, right? Better distribution of power within the system. Talk about which principles you find important, those should stay. And there's one thing, and this responds a bit to the values critique earlier. It seems somehow to be implied that Africa is an amoral or valueless place, which isn't true at all. The closest thing that I've heard, and this is very inchoate and developing in terms of a proactive African contribution to global order thinking, is this concept of human centrism, which is still not fully fleshed out, but that's the idea that we were talking before about what is a global order supposed to do for the world. And this idea coming from Africa is that it shouldn't be about competition, it shouldn't only be about preventing war and security, it should be about delivering for each individual person, right? It's very idealistic, but on the other hand, Africans are looking at us and saying, well, you all used to be quite idealistic, but it's all looking now like sharp-elbowed realpolitik and bloc competition. So maybe there's a space for Africa to bring some idealism onto the world stage.
Thank you. Now, we haven't spoken about Russia and Africa, which is also, I think, a big topic, but we need to end this now, unfortunately. Please join me in a round of applause for our brilliant panel. And thanks for defending the liberal world order.
You can see the breakout sessions here. Please follow. Our colleagues are going to show you the way.